Good day. Today is Sunday, 7th September 2025, and we have been receiving over the last couple of hours some very interesting news from the military conflict in Ukraine, news which may possibly, conceivably point to an increasing escalation of the war on the part of Russia. Now, the first thing to say is that over the course of the last 24 hours, over the course of last night to be precise, the Russians conducted what appears to have been the biggest drone attack on Ukraine that they have conducted since the beginning of the war. Now, apparently, according to the Ukrainians, 810 Geran drones were used altogether. These include Geran 2s, which are the original turboprop drones, the ones that everybody knows about, the ones that make the sound of a moped and which have become a regular part of Russian strikes on Ukraine, well, for several years now. Other drones also used were the Geran 3s, which are the new jet-powered drones which fly at higher altitudes and much greater speeds and which conduct diving attacks. From what I can work out, though this was the biggest single drone attack, I discussed earlier this year how it looked as if the factory in Kazan and another factory in Russia that is apparently also building Geran drones, with reports of a third such factory now set up in North Korea. Anyway, it seems that production has been stepped up to the point where, or would be stepped up to the point where strikes of 1,000 drones a day, perhaps every day, might become viable over the course of the autumn. Well, we've just had a strike with 810 drones, and it seems to me that we're gradually edging closer and closer to that position. So that is an important fact in itself. I've discussed in many programs that drone offensives on that scale, 1,000 drones a night, every night perhaps, is much more than any Ukrainian air defense system. However organized, whatever weapons it was using or was supplied by the West, it would be more than they could cope with, given the present resources and technologies, available. So that is an important fact in itself about last night's strike, and we are getting closer to that point of 1,000 drone strikes over the course of a single night, and it has been absolutely the case that over the last couple of weeks, drone strikes and combined drone and missile strikes have become more common, and that the scale of these strikes in terms of numbers of drones is increasing. So that's one important piece of news about the attack that took place last night. But there is something else, and that is that over the course of last night's strike, two important buildings in Ukraine received damage. Now, many of the strikes, a large proportion of the strikes, seem to have been focused again on Kiev itself. And it seems that this was mostly, overwhelmingly, a drone attack on Kiev, but it does seem that some missiles were also used, and the Russian Defense Ministry has provided a statement about the targets that were selected, specifically in Kiev, though also in other places. And I will just read what the Russian Defense Ministry says. On 7th September 2025, the Russian armed forces delivered a massive strike employing high-precision arms and strike unmanned aerial vehicles against facilities where long-range drones have been manufactured, assembled, repaired, stocked and launched, Moreover, the strikes were delivered at military air bases in the central, southern and eastern parts of Ukraine, including the Kiev 67 industrial enterprise in the western suburbs of Kiev and the STS Group logistics base in the southern part of Ukraine's capital. The objectives of the strike have been completed. All the designated targets have been neutralized. Other facilities within Kiev's border have not been affected. Now, the last sentence is the one that we should focus on. Other facilities within Kiev's border have not been affected. That is an unusual sentence to appear in a Russian account of a combined drone and missile attack. And what has provoked it, undoubtedly, is information which is all over the media in the West today, that a Duran drone struck the government building on Maidan Square, where the Ukrainian government meets. And there's ample pictures showing the effect of the strike. If it was a strike, we'll come to that in a moment. And we see fires, and we've seen damage, and Prime Minister Sidorenko of Ukraine has made statements about this, and it seems that there have been some civilian casualties connected to this strike, or at least that's what the Ukrainian authorities are saying, and I have no reason, by the way, to disbelieve them about this. And photos have also appeared showing damage, internal damage to the building caused by the strike. Now, this is a large Stalin-era building, very strong, rather ornate in places, but large, monumental, and frankly, an attack by a drone, even a drone as big and as powerful as the Duran drones are, would hardly cause it massive structural damage. The damage that has been done is damage that can be repaired. So the question is, was this intentional? Was this a deliberate strike? Was this, in other words, the beginning of a Russian campaign, or maybe not so much the beginning, but a continuation, an escalation of a Russian campaign against the decision-making centers in Kiev? Well, the short answer is, I don't know, and I am not sure. One reading of that sentence in the Ministry of Defense reports other facilities within Kiev's border have not been affected, is that it is a denial that the attack on the government building was intentional. And of course, one can come up with all kinds of explanations as to why that might be so. Maybe there was a malfunction in one of the drones. Maybe it was affected by Ukrainian jamming. The Ukrainians do use jamming, and it does sometimes have an effect, and it does cause drones to strike targets other than the ones they are aimed for. Alternatively, and I have discussed this in the past, there have been instances when Ukrainian air defense missiles have missed their targets and have landed on the ground and have caused damage to buildings, including sometimes civilian buildings. I have to say, looking at the pictures of the fire and damage at this building, in central Kiev, it does not look like that to me. It does not look like an occasion when the damage was likely done by a Ukrainian air defense missile going astray, or cannon fire from Ukrainian anti-aircraft artillery hitting the wrong target. It does look to me very, very much like the result of a drone strike. But to repeat again, it is possible that this was caused by a drone either malfunctioning or a drone being deliberately jammed by the Ukrainians and going astray. Having said this, if we go to that sentence again, it's all forms part, it's the second sentence in a single paragraph, the paragraph of which reads, "The objectives of the strike have been completed. All the designated targets have been neutralized. Other facilities within Kiev's borders have not been affected." That is not an outright, categorical, clear denial by the Russian Defense Ministry that they didn't target this building. It simply says that the Russians only hit those targets that were designated targets. The Ministry of Defense has provided a list of some of the targets: the Kiev 67 industrial enterprise, the SDS Group logistic base in southern Kiev. It's spoken about facilities that build, stockpile, repair, and launch long-range drones. But the list clearly isn't intended to be exhaustive. And of course, the possibility that this building, the government building on Maidan Square, was a designated target, it seems to me, is not inconsistent with the wording of the Russian Defense Ministry's statement, in which case the comment, "other facilities within Kiev's border have not been effective," would still be true, because that sentence simply says that only designated targets were struck, and perhaps the government building was one. I can't help but think that if it was not, the Russians would have categorically denied it. They've spent several hours since the strike took place and the hit on the building took place before releasing this statement. And as we see, the language is ambiguous. If there had been no intention at all to strike at this building, if this was all due to a fault or an error or the results of Ukrainian air defense or perhaps some kind of false flag by the Ukrainians or any of that, I personally would have expected the Russians to deny the fact outright. Clearly, this sentence is intended to be read as a denial. It's the Russians, in effect, saying, well, this building caught fire, nothing really, we're not saying really that it was us. We were attacking only designated targets. We've told you what the designated targets were: air bases and drone factories and storehouses for drones and that kind of thing. Well, as I said, it falls well short of a categorical denial. I think the Russians, this is my own guess here, I think the Russians probably did hit the building intentionally. Now, again, I want to stress the Russians are not sharing information with me, and I don't know this for a fact, but I think the Russians did hit this building intentionally. They produced, as I said, this very ambiguous denial, this very evasive denial. They don't want to admit that they did it intentionally, because doing so would appear to contradict their long-standing policy of not going against individuals that make up decision-making centres. We will come to that shortly. But I can't help but think that this was intentional in some way. The strike was conducted at night when, of course, there wouldn't have been important people, presumably, working inside the building. So it might not have been intended to kill anybody really important. in which case the strike perhaps was intended as a warning more than anything else. And we'll come to why the Russians might give a warning of this kind at this time now. Now, that's the strike in Kiev. Another important structure, not a building exactly, well, it is a building, but let's call it a structure, was also attacked by a Russian drone last night. And here I think there is little doubt about this. There's actually film which appears to show the strike taking place, and it is clearly the work of a drone. And that is the bridge across the Dnieper in the big industrial city of Kremenchuk. Now, Kremenchuk is one of the great industrial centers of Ukraine. It's one of the great cities that is strung out along the Dnieper. There is a section of Kremenchuk which is located on the east bank, though the main part of the city is on the west bank. And Kremenchuk is a key city in Ukraine's military-industrial complex. It used to build the KARZ trucks, which were very famous in the Soviet Union. I don't know whether it still does. It's also the location of what is apparently Ukraine's biggest oil refinery, one which the Russians, by the way, have attacked on several occasions. That refinery, by the way, is located on the east bank of the Dnieper. But anyway, it is a big industrial center. It is rather towards the north in terms of the geography of the Dnieper. It is well to the north of the other two big industrial cities, Zaporozhye and Dnieper, which are located also on the Dnieper, but some distance to the south. Now, there has been much discussion. In fact, it's been one of the great tantalizing unanswered questions why the Russians have not attacked the Dnieper bridges up till now. And there's been speculation that they lack the means, they don't have the resources to destroy the bridges, that the bridges are enormous, powerfully built structures that date from the Soviet era mostly, and that it would be very difficult to achieve their destruction. And anyway, all kinds of other explanations like that have been provided. Well, some months ago, I think it was about a year ago, I actually had a discussion with somebody who absolutely knows about these things. I can't disclose it, but this person pointed out to me that certainly a Kinjal missile has the explosive power and the kinetic energy to destroy any one of those bridges, and it has the precision to strike at it. The Russians have the Kinjals. They could be used effectively against any one of these bridges. The Russians have other weapons that could probably devastate these bridges as well. They have massive precision-guided Fab bombs, including the Fab 3000 bomb, which is certainly capable of destroying or inflicting massive damage on any one of these bridges, provided it is targeted at the bridge in an effective way. And, well, there are probably other weapons in the Russian arsenal as well. The Russians, as Vladimir Putin has recently been saying, have now brought the Oreshnik into service. Serial production of the Oreshnik is well underway. I've received a report about a week ago that the Ukrainians have been offering large sums to informers inside Russia to try to ascertain the bases where these Oreshnik missiles are located. I don't know whether they've had any success in that. But anyway, the Russians do operate Oreshnik missiles. These are hypersonic. These are enormously powerful missiles with tremendously powerful, kinetically powerful warheads. Putin has said that an attack by several of these missiles, Oreshnik missiles, against one target would have the destructive power of a nuclear device. Obviously, if the Russians wanted to use Oreshnik missiles to destroy the Dnieper bridges, they could do so. And, well, they probably have or will shortly acquire the means to do so. And with the Kinjal missile already in service and the Fab 3000 missile already in service, they can, of course, do it. So the Russians have, for reasons about which there has been endless speculations, they've had the ability to destroy the Dnieper bridges, the technical ability to destroy the Dnieper bridges for at least a year, probably much longer. And that capability is well within their reach. But for reasons which they have never provided, they have up to now chosen not to do so. There were reports it was the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, recently disclosed that some people within the Russian military at some point earlier this year approached Putin himself and proposed that an Oreshnik missile be used to strike at decision-making centers in Kiev, and Putin said no. It was not because the capability did not exist. It was not because use of such a missile against such decision-making centers would not be overwhelmingly effective. It was because up to now the Russians have held back from attacking the decision-making centers, and in this particular case, when use of the Oreshnik was being talked about, Putin recoiled from the idea of using such a powerful weapon in the center of a city, Kiev, when doing so would almost inevitably result in high civilian casualties. So there we are. Up to now, the Russians have chosen not to destroy the Dnieper bridges, which they have within their, which is something that they can do, something which is well within their reach. Now, so far, they have never in fact attacked the Dnieper bridges. There's never been, to my knowledge, a single instance when a Russian weapon has struck at any one of these bridges, which has allowed the Ukrainians and their Western allies to use them. Of course, all supplies to the Ukrainian forces east of the Dnieper, in Kharkiv region, in Sumy region, in Dnipropetrovsk region, in Zaporozhye region, in Donbass, reach those forces by crossing the bridges. Every weapon, all the oil, all the fuel, everything has to cross the bridge, one of these bridges, to reach the Ukrainian army, which is fighting this war. Well, yesterday, for the first time, one of the Dnieper bridges was indeed attacked. Now, these are indeed massive structures, and a single Geran drone is only going to cause superficial damage, and this, again, is what happened with this attack. There are pictures of the bridge in question. It does look scorched. You can see the soot lines, the soot marks. Clearly, some damage was done, but there's nothing to suggest that the bridge itself is no longer operable, that the damage affected the structure, the base structure of the bridge in any important way. The damage may look dramatic, but the bridge is still obviously standing, and frankly, I suspect in this case the Ukrainians could probably repair it within hours. If you wanted to attack one of these bridges and you wanted to destroy that bridge, you would not use a solitary Duran drone. So what were the Russians doing? It seems to me that with this attack on the bridge, and probably with the attack on the government building in Kiev, the Russians were giving the Ukrainians warnings. And I suspect one of those warnings was that if Ukraine continues along its present course, if it doesn't negotiate seriously with Russia, if Zelensky doesn't finally confirm that he's prepared to sit down in Moscow and perhaps talk with Putin there and start addressing Russian concerns, then the Russians still have vast numbers of weapons in their arsenal, enormous numbers of options. They can press forward with all of that, make the situation for the Ukrainians far more dangerous and far more difficult. And so far, they've conducted the special military operation without fully pulling off the gloves, but they're coming closer and closer to the point now when they might do so. Now, that is one warning. There is another possible warning, and it's important to say that the two warnings do not contradict each other. Zelensky has been talking a great deal recently about how he wants to conduct deep strikes deep inside Russia. We've had the Flamingo missile displayed, and we've seen pictures of it. By the way, various Russian bloggers are now claiming that the building within which the Flamingo missile appeared has been traced, and that it is not a factory building at all, but some kind of warehouse, and that the entire picture was staged to give the impression that the Flamingo missile is being built in Ukraine in large quantities, when this was not true. I am, of course, unable to corroborate that claim, but I bring it up because I suspect it probably is true. But there are other more potent missiles than perhaps the Flamingo that the Ukrainians might be acquiring before long. There are Taurus missiles from Germany. Now, the Germans continue to deny that they have supplied Taurus missiles to Ukraine, but the Russians say they have done, and they've given warnings about this. And I suspect the Germans have indeed supplied Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Once it became clear that the joint project between Ukraine and Germany, the Sapsan missile, which the Ukrainians were working upon and which was supposed to be some kind of ballistic missile, with a range apparently to reach Moscow itself, or at least the outskirts of Moscow, from positions on Ukraine's eastern border. Well, anyway, it looks as if the Sapsan system was completely destroyed by Russian strikes, and it would be completely in character for Friedrich Merz, the German Chancellor, to, in that case, double down by doing what the Germans had previously said they would not do, by giving Ukraine Taurus missiles. So it could be that these deep strikes that Zelensky's talking about are going to be conducted with Taurus missiles. And, well, we're still getting reports about the Iran missiles that the United States is supposed to be providing to Ukraine. Now, there's been an article in the Wall Street Journal about the Iran missile, and it's quite interesting article because the article says that the Iran has emerged within a mere 14 months since the release of solicitation in August 2024. The prototype air-launched cruise missiles have a scheduled delivery in October. The plan now is to deliver a first lot of 840 ERAMs split between two designs separately produced by Virginia-based Coaspire and California-based Zone 5 Technologies by the end of October 2026. Although Ukraine is cleared to buy up to 3,350 missiles, the first production run is smaller. The first 10 are scheduled for delivery in October. Now, this is a complicated article, but from what my own understanding of it is this, that the order for this missile, the ERAM, was first placed in August 2024. So this is a project that dates from the Biden administration, and the plan was to build 3,350 of these missiles and to deliver them to Ukraine. It was then offered, or rather contracted, to two relatively small companies, Coaspire in Virginia and Zone 5 Technologies in California. Both of these companies, as we know from previous articles, appear to have tested prototypes back in March. One of these missiles apparently uses 3D printing. And the first batch of what will still be very raw, very new missiles that have only just been developed. The first batch of 10, which are essentially prototypes, are going to be delivered to Ukraine in October. So we are looking at an October delivery of just 10 of these missiles. Now, they do not have a particularly long range, and they are relatively slow as well, as I understand it. And I don't believe that they're going to cause the Russian military much trouble. And the total number, as I said, a total number of 10 in October is not something that the Russians are going to worry particularly about. Between now and October 2026, the Ukrainians are supposed to receive 840. But again, bear in mind that these are missiles which in some respects appear to be less advanced than the ATACMS missiles, and which are of course also air-launched, so the Russians will probably get more warning of their launches than they did with the ATACMS. And the United States supplied 500 ATACMS missiles to Ukraine, and these did relatively little difference. But one way or the other, it does look as if Ukraine is being provided by the Western powers with a significant number of missiles. Well, I say significant, with a certain number of missiles over the next few weeks. Could it be that the warnings that the Russians are giving to the Ukrainians are as follows? Look, if you don't actually sit down and negotiate with us in earnest, if indeed you do start to launch deep strikes against targets inside Russia with these missiles, if you do try to use the Taurus missiles for strikes against Moscow, be well aware that we have enormously greater means of potential retaliation against you. Up to now, for our own reasons, we have exercised a certain degree of restraint. We have not come after you, the political leaders of Ukraine, personally, at least not to any great degree. We'll come to that in a moment. And of course, we have not destroyed your bridges across the Dnieper, without which you cannot sustain your armed forces in the field east of the Dnieper, and whose destruction, the destruction of those bridges, would mean that you would very quickly lose control, not just of your armed forces east of the Dnieper, but all of the territory, all of Ukraine that lies beyond the Dnieper. So don't push it. Don't think that long-range missile strikes against us are going to help you. They're simply going to make your situation worse, much worse, and they will get you personally into serious trouble and put you at enormous risk. That, it seems to me, is probably the message that the Russians are trying to convey. Now, here I'm going to say something else. I think that the days of relative Russian restraint on these issues is coming to an end anyway. I've already discussed how the Russians seem to be taking steps in the dirty war, the one that the Ukrainians, and it must be said with the help of some of their Western allies, have foolishly waged against Russia, assassinations of Russian officials and civilians inside Russia itself, attacks on Russian air bases, all of that kind of thing. And of course, bombs on railway bridges, which caused civilian trains to crash, causing deaths of civilians. A couple of weeks ago, the Russians, a senior Ukrainian intelligence officer who had been in charge of covert operations inside Russia, Lieutenant Colonel Voronich, was assassinated. Last week, a prominent nationalist Ukrainian politician, Andrei Parubi, was also killed. Now, I discussed over the course of that program the possibility that he might have been killed by many, many different parties. But I also said that it did look like a well-organized assassination to me. And I did wonder whether perhaps the Russians might have been involved. The Ukrainians apprehended a man who they say is the assassin, and he does appear to be the assassin. He's appeared in court, and he has essentially admitted that he was the person who assassinated Parubi. And he is saying, and it looks convincing, that he acted from personal motives. He apparently is very angry that his son, who had been a soldier in the Ukrainian army, is missing in action. He blames Parubi for Ukraine's current crisis, or for, at least he blames Parubi and other members of the Ukrainian political elite for the current crisis. And anyway, he appears to have strong personal reasons to want Parubi to be killed. So more likely than not, it was not the Russians who were involved in arranging Parubi's assassination. The facts, as we see them, suggest that this was indeed an assassination carried out for personal reasons, very strong personal reasons. Having said that, and I do want to just add this, it is not unknown or unusual for intelligence agencies to set up situations using an individual with a personal grievance to eliminate someone that they want to see out of the way. So I still think that there's a small chance, a 1 or 2% chance, that the Russians did perhaps play some kind of a role. But anyway, the Voronezh killing, the attacks on the missile strikes close to the buildings of the British consulate and of the European Union, the earlier attack on the building that held the British passport and visa office in Kiev, all of these do suggest to me that the Russians are gradually pulling off the gloves. And the very fact that, as Lukashenko says, some Russian military officials pressed Putin to authorize use of the Oreshnik to attack decision-making centers in Kiev, well, that tells us that there are some Russian officials who are very keen to do this very thing. And as to the enigma of the Russian failure to attack the Dnieper bridges, well, Larry Johnson on Sonar 21 has discussed conversations he's had with a senior retired Russian general, who basically suggested that it was in Russia's interests to allow the Ukrainians to deploy all of their available forces to the east bank of Ukraine, the better for the Russians to destroy those forces there and to deprive the Ukrainians of building up strong forces on the west bank of the Dnieper, where a potential new defense line might be created. Well, perhaps, given the crisis that Ukraine finds itself in, the manpower crisis, that period is ending. It could be that the Russians have come close to saying to themselves, this period of holding off the attacks on the Dnieper bridges, because we're trying to achieve a demilitarization in Ukraine by destroying its armed forces on the Ukraine's east bank, that objective has now almost been achieved. So let's press forward, let's destroy the bridges, let's simplify our operations for ourselves, and it may be that the attack on the bridge in Kremenchuk was not just a warning, but a trial run to see whether, despite presumably extensive electronic jamming to protect the bridges, and to judge the state of air defences around the bridges, whether indeed it was possible to strike and hit and damage and perhaps destroy one of these bridges in the way that the Russians arguably could, well, definitely could do. And, well, if this was a test, if it was a test of the strength of the defences of the bridge, certainly the one in Kremenchuk, we can see that it is in fact a straightforward target. The Ukrainians were not able to defend the bridge. The Duran struck it, the damage was done, and there's no reason to think that other bridges across the Dnieper are defended to any greater degree. So maybe, as I said, there's all of that going on as well. But I still think that the Russians at the moment are in the game of escalating warnings, and I think that probably they're still holding back from an all-out dirty war and from an all-out campaign to isolate the Ukrainian army on the east bank of the Dnieper. but I doubt that will continue for very much longer. I suspect that if there is going to be, as many believe, over the next few weeks, a major Russian offensive to clear Donbass once and for all, and in fact to break Ukrainian resistance east of the Dnieper, well, in that case, I expect the Russians to take stronger action. Quite plausibly, they will at that point attack and destroy the bridges, and at some point, quite plausibly also, if they decide it is in their interests, they will conduct a systematic operation against the decision-making centers in Kiev. Anyway, whatever. These attacks yesterday, last night, the hit on the government building in Kiev and the attack on the bridge in Kremenchuk together suggest to me that the war is indeed about to escalate and escalate significantly, and that we will be seeing a major Russian effort between now and probably the end of the year to break Ukrainian defenses in Donbass once and for all, and to set the scene for Russia's final victory. I would add, by the way, that if the bridges across the Dnieper are indeed destroyed, all of them, then it will not prevent the Russians crossing the Dnieper themselves if they choose to do so. I understand that they have been rehearsing doing this very thing for some time, and of course they know how to do this. They train in river crossings probably more than any other army, and they forced a crossing of the Dnieper against much more intense German opposition during the Second World War. And they've even released a film about it, by the way, a film that was made in the 1960s. So the Russians could still cross the Dnieper into western Ukraine if they were interested or seeking, for example, to capture the remaining cities on Ukraine's Black Sea coast, Odessa, Nikolaev, and all of those places. They can still do it, even if the bridges, the current bridges, the existing bridges, are all destroyed. Anyway, there we go. Some speculation, obviously, but the attack on the bridge seems to be undoubted. And as I said, if you look at the Russian statements and look at the pictures of the attack on the government building in Kiev, I think that was intentional as well. And I think that the Russians were involved. Anyway, since I've discussed at some length the military situation, I might as well move on and discuss a bit more the ground situation in the war. The Russians have been continuing what is now starting to develop into a fairly rapid advance in western Donbass eastwards towards ultimately the Dnieper and the city of Zaporozhye. They seem to be gradually moving towards investing surrounding the village, the important village of Veliko Mikhailova, and it's possible that a big battle for this village will take place over the next couple of days. And it seems to me that if they capture this village, then we can definitely say that they are moving towards breaking the supply lines, cutting the supply lines to the southern towns of Orekhov and Gulyapolye in Zaporozhye, and subsequently to moving still further west towards the city of Zaporozhye itself, which they are, of course, also approaching from the south. I'm not going to discuss this part of the battle further. There is an enormously complex battle taking place around the town of Pokrovsk. And here it is extremely difficult to get a clear picture of what exactly is happening, because we are getting lots of inconsistent claims and reports. I said in a program that I did 2 days ago that Radovka is saying that the Ukrainians are conducting counterattacks to try to roll back again the area of the Russian breakthrough northeast of Pokrovsk. The Radovka speculated that these counterattacks would fail, and for the record, most of the reports that I have seen from the various bloggers appear to support that claim. It'll probably take several more days before the situation here becomes clearer. But for the record, I've heard, for example, that the key village of Shachova, to the east of this breakthrough area, is now mostly captured by the Russians, and that the fighting there continues, and that the Russians continue to make advances there. There are also further reports that the Russians have indeed secured fully the village of Udachny. I have no doubt about that, by the way, and that they are indeed in the process of capturing the mine that lies to the north of Udachny, and that they are indeed close to the E50 highway in this area from the south, and that they are also, by the way, continuing their advances inside Pokrovsk itself, and that more and more of this town, this important town, is now falling under their control. There have also been many reports of further Russian advances in the Konstantinovka area, which I'm not going to discuss further in this program, because again, this looks like a very complex battle, and I will need more time both to understand exactly what is happening and to discuss it in detail. There are also reports coming from a variety of sources that the situation in Kupiansk is now indeed in grave crisis, that the Russians control most of this town, and that Ukrainian resistance in Kupiansk is finally on the brink of collapse. I have seen very difficult and contradictory reports, difficult to understand and contradictory reports about this. But anyway, we will find out eventually, no doubt, within the next couple of days, more clearly what is going on in Kupiansk. The most complicated battles of all, however, appear to be taking place in the Siversk area. Now, Siversk-Liman area. Now, there are reports that the Russians are attacking in the area of the Kremenchuk and Serebyanka forests, that they've captured at least 2 more villages, and that they have advanced south, and that there is now fighting going on in the critically important village of Yampol, which is located between Liman and Siversk. Yampol, if Yampol is captured by the Russians, and the Russians consolidate control of Yampol, then it seems to me that the Battle of Siversk is lost, and it will be all but impossible for the Ukrainians to continue to defend Siversk, because effectively their supplies will be cut. Their supplies, which they receive from Slavyansk and which pass, by the way, through Liman, which go to Siversk, those supply lines will be cut. I cannot see how Siversk can be defended if Yampol and the areas around it are irretrievably lost. And supporting that, there are also reports that the Russians are now shelling, and this is no longer drone attacks, it's artillery shelling, Siversk itself, and that the town is being shelled very heavily. However, there is an intrigue, because our old friend Andrei Marochko has been suggesting that the Russians are withdrawing from the village of Serebyanka, which is located immediately to the north of Siversk. Now, the Russians captured Serebyanka some weeks ago. This is a major battle and an important village for the Russians to capture. A lot of commentators have said that if Serebianka fell, Ukrainian defences in Siversk would become untenable. So I don't know whether that was true, but it's certainly a village that one would expect the Russians to defend. There have been reports of a Ukrainian counterattack around around Serebianka, which supposedly has recaptured some of the ground there. And, well, we've now had Marochko himself appearing to confirm that this Ukrainian counterattack has been successful and that the Russians are indeed withdrawing from Serebianka. I have to say this does surprise me because it is so completely against all of the flow of information that we are being provided about the general situation around Siversk. But this is what Marochko said. With regard to Serebianka, our servicemen are gradually leaving the settlement and gaining a foothold in its vicinity. Our military continues to knock out the enemy from the Dronovka area, where the main forces and means of the armed forces of Ukraine are now concentrated. And anyway, we'll see what this all means and why the Russians would withdraw from Serebianka. Obviously, it could be that they were taken by surprise by the Ukrainian counterattack. It could be that somebody has failed in some way, or it could be that the imminent fall of Yampol perhaps means that the Russians don't feel that it is important to defend Serebianka anymore. I don't know. But anyway, the news from Serebianka continues to show that the Ukrainians are still able to put up a fight. They're still able to attack in places, even though overall, across the conflict lines, the line of conflict, it's clear that their situation continues to deteriorate. Anyway, that's the military situation. And as I said, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's massive numbers of rumors about the Russians concentrating enormous forces in the Pokrovsk, Konstantinovka area with a view to finally breaking Ukrainian resistance there. There are lots of reports, including from the Ukrainian side, that the Ukrainians are suffering massive losses, very heavy losses, as a result of the counterattacks around Pokrovsk and Konstantinovka that they are undertaking. So that is the main story, but the Ukrainians still have energy and are still able to counterattack in places, and that seems to be what has happened in Serebianka. Though I doubt, in fact, if they do recapture Serebianka, I have no doubt that they will lose it very quickly again. Anyway, let's move on and discuss other news, because my own sense is that we are, in fact, at an inflection point in world affairs, not just the affairs of Europe or the United States or in the economy. I have been thinking a great deal about the events of the last week, which I think were extremely important. The meetings that took place in China, the coming together of three of the most powerful men in the world, Modi, Putin, and Xi Jinping, and the fact that they seem to be coming together, in effect, as a kind of a team. The fact that this has caused alarm, apparently, in the United States. The fourth most powerful man, Donald Trump, the President of the United States, was not, of course, at this meeting. And I get the sense that he, in particular, has some regrets about this. But anyway, as I've discussed in recent programs, we've now reached a point where the Western powers are no longer able to supply Ukraine with huge numbers of weapons. Nobody believes that there's anything the Western powers can do that can restore the military balance in Ukraine. And nobody, I think, quietly denies any longer that the Russians are winning the war and the Ukrainians are losing it. There is more and more articles appearing in the West. There was a very strong one by Owen Matthews in the Daily Telegraph. There's been a brilliant article, by the way, very different person, but very brilliant article by Ian Proud, the former British diplomat, who I should emphasize is a personal friend. At least I consider him such. Anyway, Ian Proud has written a wonderful comment about the coalition of the willing meeting last week, the fact that it came up with the same tired proposals that we've been hearing for so long, endlessly repeating the same ideas about how to conduct, how to deploy peacekeeping forces, alleged peacekeeping forces to Ukraine, how this is all meaningless, how this is simply a repetition of the same thing again and again and again. The article, if you want to read it, it's on his blog, The Peacemonger. It goes by the name Coalition of the Unwilling Gets Stuck in Groundhog Day. And he goes on to say that, they go on. This is all familiar. All of the ideas sound familiar. The headlines could have been written at any time since March 2025, when the coalition was formed at a meeting in London. Remove the latest references, and the headlines could have been written at any time since the war started. We're just going, in Europe, we're going round and round in circles, and the Europeans are starting to realise this themselves. One gets the sense of growing exhaustion, even on the part of the Europeans about this. Of course, there's going to be a meeting tomorrow between the Europeans and the Americans, but I don't think anybody really seriously believes that the Europeans are going to get from the Americans the kind of backstop and guarantees that they are looking for their forces in Ukraine. And everybody anyway realizes that without the Russians' agreement, these forces, these European NATO forces, will never go to Ukraine. Owen Matthews, by the way, in the Daily Telegraph, reiterates that point extremely clearly. So there is a sense of exhaustion. There is a sense of people repeating themselves, going over the same ground again and again. There is a gradual recognition that after the meetings that took place in China, the idea of imposing massive sanctions on Russia, that's not going to achieve anything. And after the debacle with India, the idea of imposing further tariffs and sanctions on Russia's trading partners, that also simply isn't going to work. So both in Europe and in the United States, they're suddenly now starting to confront the fact that they are really now out of options and out of leverage. There is nothing more or further that they can do that is going to change the situation. I doubt that anybody, except perhaps Friedrich Merz, believes that 150 Taurus missiles are going to change the direction of the war. And, well, we see that the Iran missile is really just another relatively basic weapon which is not going to be available in large quantities anytime soon, and which also cannot change the overall course of the war. So I get the sense that we're at an inflection point, that people in the West are gradually starting to understand and accept that the war in Ukraine is lost. They may not be willing to say that publicly, But I think that dawning realization now exists. I've already said that, in my opinion, the Ukrainians themselves, Zelensky and his senior officials, came to understand that sometime around June, July. They, the Ukrainians, realized that more likely than not, they were going to lose the war and lose it conclusively sometime in July. And we've seen Putin now make comments in which he appears to say that the only practical solution is a military solution, that negotiations ultimately are a road to nowhere. And we've seen, and I've discussed it at length in this program, that the Russians increasingly seem to be willing to take off the gloves. If the Europeans and the Americans are becoming exhausted with this war, I think the Russians take the exactly contrary stance. There's an article in the Wall Street Journal which says that Putin's calculations is that he can break the Ukrainian army before the West can break his economy. I absolutely believe that Vladimir Putin believes that the Russian army can break the Ukrainian army, and that he seriously expects that this will happen, and probably fairly soon. I don't believe that Putin has any fears that the Russian economy is going to break at any time. And of course, one of the things that has happened, which has changed the entire atmosphere and the strategic calculations in Moscow, are the series of meetings and decisions that took place over the last couple of weeks, and especially those which happened in China. This time last year, the Russians were having to contend with a series of diplomatic initiatives coming from their BRICS partners, China, India and Brazil, perhaps especially Brazil, which seemed to be directed to trying to get the Russians to agree to a ceasefire in Ukraine, a ceasefire which the Russians didn't want. And the Russians, as I very well remember, got rather irritated by some of this pressure. It played a role in the diplomacy between the BRICS countries on the eve of the Kazan summit meeting in October. The Russians then breathed a sigh of relief when the summit meeting in Kazan took place, and this topic wasn't raised substantively then. But perhaps to their annoyance, the topic of the ceasefire was then brought up again by Donald Trump and, of course, Keith Kellogg and the others after Trump was inaugurated US president. And there must have been some concern in Moscow that, given that the Brazilians in particular, but some of the other BRICS states, had also shown some inclination to go along with the ceasefire idea before Trump appeared to endorse it, that there would be a combination, that the BRICS states, Brazil and India maybe, would come together with the United States, and they would all agree to unite and pressure the Russians to agree to the ceasefire and, in effect, the freeze of the conflict, which the Russians didn't want. Well, fairly skillful, very skillful diplomacy by the Russians, and rather clumsy diplomacy, not just by the United States and the Trump administration, but by the European powers, perhaps first and foremost. European intransigence, Ukrainian intransigence, even more, meant that coming together of the BRICS moderates, if you like, and of the Americans never really happened. And just as the BRICS states last year were persuaded to drop their calls for a ceasefire, at the summit meeting in Alaska, the Americans dropped the call for a ceasefire also. It says quite a lot for Russia's diplomatic skills that they were able to do this, both with their BRICS allies and with the United States and Donald Trump as well, whilst at the same time being able to keep both sides apart from each other. Anyway, what has now happened is that over the last 10 days, the various BRICS states have come together and they have affirmed their backing of Russia in unequivocal terms. India will continue to buy Russian oil. China is going to buy Russian gas in even greater quantities than it is doing today. There is going to be an emergency BRICS summit convened by none other than President Lula of Brazil. The BRICS collectively are putting up two fingers to the Europeans and to the Americans. And as I said, this has completely changed the entire diplomatic atmosphere. If the Russians are starting to tell themselves that they're now able to take off the gloves in the war itself, to attack the Dnieper bridges, to attack government buildings in Kiev, then it could be because they feel that they have finally bought themselves the diplomatic space. Their diplomacy has been so successful that they have brought themselves to that position. Note that after the strike on the government building in Kiev and after the strike on the bridge in Kremenchuk, American response, and by the way, response from the BRICS states, has at least for the moment been fairly muted. And one other possibility, by the way, concerning these strikes is that they were also trial balloons by the Russians to see how both the Americans and their BRICS allies would react if strikes like this took place. So that probably explains why Putin is able to speak now about pressing forward towards a military victory and why we're starting to see the Russians escalate or begin a process of escalation on the Ukrainian battlefields and in the sky. Now, there is something further to say here. In my opinion, the whole crisis in Ukraine originated ultimately from a neocon project to try to isolate and break Russia and push it away from the Black Sea and create a crisis there so that a new government in Russia could be established that would change Russian policy, redirect Russian policy, realign Russian policy with the United States and isolate China. After all, Mr. Wes Mitchell discussed this whole project at length in that article that appeared in August 2021 in the National Interest. And of course, as it turns out, Mr. Wes Mitchell is a close friend of the the Assistant Secretary for War, we must call it the Department of War now, in other words, in the Pentagon, Elbridge Colby, who appears to be the major planner now of US policy. Now, that project has now clearly failed. The Russians have rebuffed the attempts to organize their defeat in Ukraine what was suggested in West Mitchell's August 2021 article. And the Russians have solidified, cemented their de facto alliance, strategic partnership, if you prefer, with China. This is what the Power of Siberia 2 gas pipeline geopolitically tells us. The Chinese, meanwhile, have continued to gather power, and they've continued to gather influence. The success of the meetings that took place in China yesterday point to that fact. The United States is starting to realize that its project, therefore, to sustain its global hegemony is now failing. It's failing in Ukraine. They're still trying various things in East Asia, but it's looking increasingly like they're not going to succeed. So we've had a number of very interesting moves from the United States. Firstly, we've had new papers apparently appearing in the Pentagon which say that the United States should retreat and consolidate defending the Western Hemisphere. In other words, its sphere of influence. Canada, perhaps Greenland, but also Latin America. We see the pressure currently on Venezuela, where a large US fleet has gathered off its coast. There's been already destruction of a small merchant ship, apparently, or boat of some kind, in the Venezuelan coast. Larry Johnson has written importantly about this topic on Sonar 2021. But the United States is now making threats to shoot down Venezuelan fighter jets. There are further reports of growing troop movements both on Venezuela's side and on the US side. And I, for one, have little doubt that an armed clash of some kind between the United States and Venezuela, whose objective will undoubtedly be to overthrow the government of Venezuela, which the United States claims is actually a organized crime drugs cartel. Anyway, I have no doubt that a strike on Venezuela is coming. And the United States has also apparently signaled to the East Europeans that it is no longer, that it's going to pull back funding on some of the programs in Eastern Europe and in the Baltic, which were intended to strengthen NATO's eastern flank. Arnaud Bertrand, who is an extremely brilliant analyst and who writes very interestingly on his Substack blog, recently wrote about how the United States, despite all the thunder and noise, is already in the process of undertaking a retreat from Asia. If we look behind all of the noise that we've heard from the Trump administration over the last year, might we not in fact see a similar retreat happening in Europe? That the Americans are gradually tiring or realizing that Project Ukraine has failed and that they're starting to edge away from it. It's starting to seem like that to me, I have to say. And even the retitling of the Department of Defense, calling it again the Department of War, the War Department, smacks of a time before the 1940s when the United States was more concerned about protecting its sphere of influence than of expanding its reach to all corners of the world. Now, let me stress, this is an impression only. And of course, there will be many, many people in the United States who will hotly resist this, even if it is a policy or at least a trend within the government. There will be many people who will say that the United States is obligated in some way to continue to defend Ukraine and to continue to defend Taiwan and to continue to defend all sorts of places all around the world. It must continue to interfere and involve itself in the Middle East and all of that. So this is not a done thing. But I understand that the Europeans were shocked by the decision by the Americans to pull back from the support of the East European militaries, and they were very upset by their latest telephone call with Donald Trump, in which they expected him to come forward offering backstops and security guarantees and promising further massive sanctions and tariffs against the Russians, only to find that he was not interested or not ready to do so. So maybe these trends are there. It doesn't follow that these trends won't reverse, by the way. This is a very unstable situation. But I personally would not be surprised if in the future, when people take a look back on the events of this autumn, they will agree that that inflection point was reached then. That from that moment on, it is a case for the United States of retreat from empire rather than the attempts that we've seen for so long to go on extending and enlarging it. Well, anyway, that's my view. To repeat again, I think that in the case of Ukraine, the war there, the outcome is now written in stone. I don't think there is anything that can change it. The last piece in the structure of victory from a Russian point of view was the reaffirmation of the Chinese, the Indians, and the other BRIC states to support Russia. From that moment, from this point on, I don't think the Russians have anything very much to fear. They will focus on the war, and they will go on doing so until they achieve victory. Well, this is where I end my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various channels, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar and by going to our shop. Last but not least, if you've liked this program, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.